On May 19, 1977, a young woman's decision to accept a ride from strangers would lead to one of the most disturbing cases of kidnapping, torture, and psychological manipulation in American criminal history. Colleen Stan, a 20-year-old from Eugene, Oregon, would spend the next 7 years in captivity, subjected to unimaginable abuse that would redefine experts' understanding of Stockholm Syndrome, learned helplessness, and the depths of human cruelty. Her case would become a landmark study in criminal psychology, victimology, and the complex dynamics of long-term captivity. Colleen Stan was born on December 31, 1956, in Eugene, Oregon, into a working-class family. She was described by those who knew her as a kind, trusting young woman with a gentle disposition that made her popular among her peers. Growing up in the relatively safe environment of 1960s and early 1970s Oregon, Colleen embodied the innocence and optimism of her generation. At 20 years old, Colleen was at a pivotal point in her life. She had recently moved out of her family home and was working to establish her independence. Like many young adults of her era, she was comfortable with hitchhiking, a common practice that was generally considered relatively safe in smaller communities and rural areas. On that fateful day in May 1977, Colleen was planning to visit a friend in Northern California. Unable to afford bus fare, she decided to hitchhike from Eugene to her destination, a journey that thousands of young people made safely every year. Her trusting nature and the social norms of the time made her comfortable accepting rides from strangers, a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. Colleen's family described her as someone who saw the best in people and had difficulty imagining that others might harbor malicious intentions. This trusting disposition, while admirable in normal circumstances, would make her particularly vulnerable to the predators she was about to encounter. The couple who would forever change Colleen's life appeared, on the surface, to be an ordinary married pair. Cameron Hooker, born in 1953, was a 23-year-old mill worker who had grown up in the small community of Red Bluff, California. To neighbors and acquaintances, he seemed like a typical blue-collar worker, quiet, reserved, and unremarkable in most ways. However, beneath this mundane exterior lurked a deeply disturbed individual with violent sexual fantasies that had been developing since his teenage years. Cameron had been exposed to sadomasochistic pornography at a young age and had developed an obsession with bondage, torture, and sexual slavery that would drive him to increasingly extreme behaviors. His wife, Janice Hooker, was 19 years old and had married Cameron when she was just 15. Their relationship was characterized by Cameron's complete domination over his young wife. Janice had been isolated from her family and friends and subjected to psychological manipulation that made her compliant with Cameron's increasingly bizarre and violent sexual demands. The dynamic between Cameron and Janice was crucial to understanding how the subsequent crimes were possible. Cameron had established himself as the absolute authority in their relationship, using a combination of physical intimidation, emotional manipulation, and religious indoctrination to ensure Janice's compliance. He had convinced her that his desires were divinely inspired and that resistance would bring divine punishment. Cameron had been fantasizing about kidnapping and enslaving a woman for several years before the encounter with Colleen Stan. He had built elaborate torture devices and created a detailed mental framework for how he would control and manipulate a captive. Janice, despite her own victimization, had become complicit in these fantasies and would play a crucial role in the crimes that followed. On May 19, 1977, Colleen Stan was hitchhiking along Interstate 5 in Northern California when she was picked up by Cameron and Janice Hooker. The couple was traveling with their infant daughter, which gave Colleen a sense of security. She later stated that the presence of the baby made her feel the ride would be safe. Initially, the ride proceeded normally. Cameron and Janice appeared to be a typical young family, and conversation was pleasant and unremarkable. However, after driving for some time, Cameron suddenly pulled off the main highway onto a remote side road, claiming he needed to stop for gas or to check something with the car. Once they were in an isolated area, Cameron's demeanor changed completely. He produced a knife and pointed it at Colleen, ordering her to comply with his demands or face deadly consequences. The transformation was so sudden and complete that Colleen was initially unable to process what was happening. Cameron forced Colleen to put on a wooden box that he had constructed specifically for this purpose. The box was designed to fit over a person's head and was equipped with locks and leather straps. Once the box was secured, Colleen was effectively blinded and could only hear what was happening around her. The psychological impact of this initial phase of the abduction cannot be overstated. In a matter of minutes, Colleen went from feeling safe and secure to being completely helpless and at the mercy of strangers who had revealed themselves to be capable of extreme violence. The sensory deprivation caused by the head box intensified her fear and disorientation. After securing the head box, Cameron and Janice drove Colleen to their home in Red Bluff, California. During the journey, Cameron began what would become a 7-year campaign of psychological manipulation, explaining to Colleen that she was now the property of a powerful organization called the Company, and that any attempt to escape or resist would result in the torture and death of both herself and her family members. Upon arriving at the Hooker residence, Colleen was introduced to what would become her primary living space for much of the next 7 years, a wooden box constructed beneath the couple's bed. The box measured approximately 2 feet by 2 feet by 4 feet, barely large enough for a person to lie down in a fetal position. The construction of this prison was elaborate and showed extensive planning on Cameron's part. The box was soundproof and ventilated through small holes that provided just enough air to sustain life. It was equipped with a bedpan for bodily functions and had hooks and restraints built into its walls. The lid could be locked from the outside, making escape impossible. Colleen would spend an estimated 23 hours per day in this box during the early years of her captivity. She was allowed out only for brief periods to eat, use a proper bathroom, or when Cameron wanted to torture or sexually assault her. The psychological effects of this extreme confinement were profound and immediate. The sensory deprivation experienced in the box was a form of torture in itself. Colleen was deprived of light, sound, and human contact for extended periods. She could hear the family going about their daily routines above her but was powerless to communicate or seek help. This isolation led to severe depression, anxiety, and a gradual erosion of her sense of self and reality. Cameron had designed the box not just as a prison, but as a tool for psychological conditioning. The extreme discomfort and isolation made Colleen increasingly dependent on her captors for any relief from her suffering. Even the brief periods outside the box became precious to her, and she found herself grateful for the smallest acts of apparent kindness from her captors. The physical effects of prolonged confinement were equally severe. Colleen suffered from muscle atrophy, joint problems, and various health issues related to the cramped conditions and poor nutrition. Her hair began to fall out, and her weight dropped dramatically. The lack of sunlight and fresh air contributed to vitamin deficiencies and a weakened immune system. One of the most sophisticated aspects of Cameron Hooker's method of control was his creation of an elaborate fictional organization called the Company. According to the mythology he created, the Company was a powerful, far-reaching organization involved in slavery and human trafficking. Cameron claimed to be merely a local operative following orders from higher authorities. This fictional framework served several psychological purposes. First, it made Cameron appear to be just another cog in a larger machine, reducing Colleen's focus on him as an individual enemy. Second, it created the impression that escape was impossible because the Company had unlimited resources and reach. Most importantly, it provided a justification for the treatment Colleen was receiving. She wasn't being tortured by a sadistic individual, but was being processed, by a professional organization. Cameron supported this fiction with elaborate props and staging. He created fake contracts, official-looking documents, and even staged phone calls with imaginary superiors. He convinced Colleen that the company had conducted extensive surveillance on her family and friends and would harm them if she attempted to escape or failed to comply with instructions. The psychological impact of this deception was profound. Colleen began to see her captors not as criminals who had kidnapped her, but as representatives of a system that was beyond her ability to resist or escape. This shifted her mental framework from looking for opportunities to escape to focusing on survival within the system she believed existed. Cameron also used religious and spiritual manipulation as part of his control system. He claimed that the company had divine sanction for its activities and that Colleen's suffering was part of a larger spiritual purpose. This exploitation of spiritual beliefs added another layer to the psychological trap he had constructed. As part of his elaborate control system, Cameron Hooker forced Colleen to sign a slave contract that outlined her complete submission to his will. The document, while having no legal validity, served important psychological functions in cementing her captivity. The contract was written in legalistic language that made it appear official and binding. It included clauses about Colleen's complete obedience, her status as property, and the severe consequences for any violations of its terms. By forcing Colleen to sign this document, Cameron was using a technique common to cult leaders and totalitarian regimes, making the victim participate in their own subjugation. The signing of the contract marked a turning point in Colleen's psychological state. She later described feeling that she had somehow legitimized her captivity by signing the document, even though she had no choice in the matter. This feeling of complicity, though entirely irrational, became part of the mental trap that kept her from seeking freedom even when opportunities arose. Cameron reinforced the contract through constant repetition of its terms and regular, refresher sessions where he would read portions aloud and require Colleen to acknowledge her understanding and acceptance. These sessions served to keep the psychological framework fresh in her mind and prevent her from developing thoughts of resistance or escape. The contract also included provisions about Colleen's eventual training for service to other members of the company. This created a framework where her current suffering was presented as preparation for an even worse fate, making her current situation seem relatively tolerable by comparison. The physical abuse that Colleen endured during her captivity was systematic and designed to reinforce the psychological control mechanisms. Cameron had constructed various torture devices, including electrical shock equipment, restraint systems, and instruments designed to cause pain without leaving permanent visible marks. The electrical torture was particularly significant because it left Colleen with a lifelong terror of anything electrical. Cameron would use electrical shocks as both punishment for perceived infractions and as a means of sexual gratification. The unpredictable nature of these sessions kept Colleen in a constant state of anxiety and hypervigilance. Sexual abuse was a constant feature of Colleen's captivity. Cameron treated her as his personal property, available for his use at any time. The sexual assaults were often combined with physical restraints and torture, creating a complex trauma that would take years to address through therapy. The combination of physical and sexual abuse served Cameron's purposes of maintaining control while satisfying his sadistic impulses. The unpredictable timing and nature of these episodes prevented Colleen from developing any sense of safety or routine that might have helped her maintain psychological resistance. Janice Hooker's role during these abusive episodes was complex and troubling. While she was clearly another victim of Cameron's manipulation and control, she also participated in some of the abuse and was present during much of it. Her presence added another layer of psychological confusion for Colleen, who struggled to understand how another woman could be complicit in such treatment. As the months turned into years, Colleen's captivity developed its own routine and rhythm. She was gradually allowed out of the box for longer periods, though she remained under constant surveillance and control. Cameron began using her for household chores, treating her as unpaid labor in addition to his sexual slave. The household routine that developed was surreal in its apparent normalcy. Colleen would be required to help with cooking, cleaning, and childcare, all while wearing a shock collar or other restraint devices. To neighbors and casual observers, she appeared to be a live-in helper or relative, though her obvious fear and subservience occasionally raised questions. Cameron's control over daily life was total and arbitrary. He dictated what Colleen could eat, when she could sleep, what clothing she could wear, and even when she was allowed to use the bathroom. This micromanagement served to reinforce her complete dependence on him for even the most basic human needs. The presence of the hooker's children added another complex dynamic to the situation. Colleen was required to help care for the children while being tortured and abused by their parents. The children, who were very young, gradually came to see Colleen as a normal part of the household, not understanding the true nature of her presence. During this period, Colleen's personality underwent significant changes as she adapted to her circumstances. She became extremely compliant and anticipatory of Cameron's needs, developing the hypervigilance and people-pleasing behaviors common to long-term abuse victims. Her sense of self gradually eroded as she focused entirely on survival. After several years of captivity, Cameron began allowing Colleen increasing amounts of freedom as a test of the psychological control he had established. This phase of her captivity was in many ways more psychologically complex than the period of total confinement. Cameron began allowing Colleen to work outside the home, first in closely monitored situations and later with increasing independence. He found her a job at a local motel, where she worked as a maid under close supervision. The income she earned was turned over to Cameron, adding an economic dimension to her exploitation. The work outside the home provided Colleen with her first regular contact with people outside the hooker household in years. However, Cameron's psychological conditioning proved remarkably effective. Despite having opportunities to seek help, Colleen remained convinced that the company was watching her and would harm her family if she attempted to escape. Cameron also began allowing Colleen to make supervised phone calls to her family, further testing the effectiveness of his control system. These calls were carefully monitored, and Colleen was required to follow scripts that portrayed her as being happy and voluntarily away from home. The calls served the dual purpose of reassuring her family that she was safe while reinforcing her isolation. Perhaps most remarkably, Cameron eventually allowed Colleen to visit her family for brief periods, always with the understanding that she would return voluntarily. These visits were possible because Cameron was confident that his psychological conditioning was complete and that Colleen truly believed she had no choice but to return to captivity. The dynamics between Cameron and Janice Hooker began to shift as the years of Colleen's captivity continued. While Janice had initially been complicit in her husband's crimes, she gradually began to question what was happening and her role in it. Several factors contributed to Janice's growing discomfort with the situation. The birth of additional children made her more aware of the moral implications of what was happening in her home. She also began to understand that Cameron's claims about the company were fabricated and that she and Colleen were both victims of his elaborate deception. Janice's religious faith also played a role in her growing crisis of conscience. She had been raised in a Christian household and gradually began to understand that what was happening in her home was fundamentally incompatible with her religious beliefs, despite Cameron's claims to divine sanction. The psychological control that Cameron exercised over Janice was similar in many ways to what Colleen experienced, though Janice had marginally more freedom and status within the household hierarchy. Like Colleen, she had been isolated from outside support systems and made to believe that resistance was impossible or would lead to severe consequences. As Janice's doubts grew, she began to provide small acts of kindness to Colleen when Cameron was not present. These gestures, while minor, represented the first cracks in the system of control that Cameron had established. They also provided Colleen with crucial evidence that the monolithic control system she believed in was not as absolute as she had been led to believe. By 1984, after 7 years of Colleen's captivity, Janice Hooker reached a breaking point that would ultimately lead to the exposure of Cameron's crimes. The combination of her growing moral awareness, fear for her own children's safety, and recognition that Cameron's behavior was escalating rather than stabilizing led her to make the dangerous decision to act. Janice's decision was complicated by her own victimization and fear. She knew that revealing Cameron's crimes would also expose her own complicity and could result in criminal charges against her. She also feared Cameron's reaction if he discovered her betrayal, as she had seen firsthand what he was capable of when opposed. The catalyst for Janice's decision came when Cameron began discussing plans to kidnap additional victims. The prospect of more women suffering the same fate as Colleen, combined with fears about what this might mean for her children's safety, finally motivated Janice to overcome her own fear and conditioning. In August 1984, while Cameron was at work, Janice approached Colleen with a revelation that would shatter the psychological framework that had controlled both women for years. She told Colleen that the company did not exist and that Cameron had fabricated the entire story to control her. This single conversation would begin the process that would eventually lead to Colleen's freedom and Cameron's arrest. The impact of this revelation on Colleen cannot be overstated. In one conversation, the entire psychological structure that had governed her life for 7 years collapsed. The realization that she had been living in an elaborate fiction, that her family had never been in danger, and that she could have escaped at any point during recent years was both liberating and devastating. Armed with the knowledge that the company was fictional, Colleen began planning her escape. However, even with this crucial information, leaving was not simple. 7 years of psychological conditioning could not be overcome overnight, and Colleen struggled with fear, guilt, and uncertainty about what would happen next. Janice Hooker continued to provide support and encouragement, helping Colleen understand that escape was not only possible but necessary. The two women, both victims of Cameron's manipulation, formed a tentative alliance that would prove crucial to ending the nightmare. On August 10, 1984, Colleen finally left the Hooker residence and returned to her family in Eugene, Oregon. The reunion was emotionally overwhelming for both Colleen and her family members, who had spent 7 years wondering what had happened to her and whether she was still alive. However, Colleen's return to freedom was complicated by the psychological trauma she had endured. She struggled with basic decisions, suffered from severe anxiety and depression, and found it difficult to readjust to normal social interactions. The psychological scars of her captivity would require years of therapy to address. Initially, Colleen was reluctant to contact authorities about her experience. The shame, guilt, and continued psychological effects of her captivity made her hesitant to expose what had happened. She also feared that she would not be believed or that she might be held responsible for her own victimization. The process of bringing Cameron Hooker to justice began when Janice Hooker contacted authorities and provided detailed information about her husband's crimes. Her decision to cooperate with law enforcement was crucial to the case, as she was the only witness who could corroborate Colleen's account of her captivity. Janice's cooperation came at great personal cost. She faced potential criminal charges for her role in Colleen's captivity and had to confront the possibility of losing custody of her children. However, she recognized that exposing Cameron's crimes was necessary to prevent future victimizations and to allow healing for everyone involved. When investigators approached Colleen about pressing charges, she initially struggled with the decision. The prospect of reliving her trauma in a public trial was daunting, and she worried about whether a jury would understand the complex psychological dynamics that had kept her in captivity even when she had opportunities to escape. The physical evidence supporting Colleen's account was extensive. Investigators found the wooden box beneath the hooker's bed, along with torture devices, restraints, and the elaborate props that Cameron had used to support his company fiction. This physical evidence was crucial in validating Colleen's testimony and demonstrating the systematic nature of her abuse. Cameron Hooker was arrested on November 18, 1984, and charged with kidnapping, rape, and various other crimes related to Colleen's captivity. His arrest sent shockwaves through the Red Bluff community, where he had been regarded as a quiet, unremarkable resident. The trial of Cameron Hooker began in 1985 and attracted national attention due to the extreme nature of the crimes and the unusual circumstances of the case. The prosecution faced the challenge of helping a jury understand how an intelligent, capable woman could remain in captivity for 7 years when she had opportunities to escape. Expert witnesses in psychology and trauma were crucial to the prosecution's case. They explained concepts like Stockholm Syndrome, learned helplessness, and the psychological effects of long-term abuse that made Colleen's behavior understandable rather than inexplicable. These testimonies were groundbreaking in their application to a criminal case. Colleen's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Despite the emotional difficulty of reliving her trauma in public, she provided detailed, consistent accounts of her captivity and abuse. Her ability to describe specific details and her obvious psychological trauma helped convince the jury of the truth of her account. The defense attempted to argue that Colleen had been a willing participant in the relationship and had remained by choice rather than through coercion. This strategy, while understandable from a legal perspective, was deeply traumatic for Colleen and reflected common misconceptions about the psychology of abuse victims. Janice Hooker's testimony was also crucial to the case. As part of a plea agreement, she testified against her husband, providing corroboration for Colleen's account and insight into Cameron's methods and motivations. Her decision to testify represented a final break from the psychological control Cameron had exercised over her. The physical evidence presented at trial was compelling and disturbing. The jury was shown the wooden box where Colleen had been imprisoned, along with photographs of the torture devices and restraints. This evidence provided tangible proof of the systematic nature of the abuse and helped counter defense arguments about willing participation. On September 7, 1985, Cameron Hooker was found guilty on multiple charges including kidnapping, rape, and assault. The jury's verdict reflected their understanding that Colleen had been the victim of an elaborate and systematic campaign of abuse rather than a willing participant in an unusual relationship. Cameron was sentenced to 104 years in prison, effectively ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life incarcerated. The lengthy sentence reflected the severity and duration of his crimes, as well as the judge's recognition that he posed a continued danger to society. The conviction represented a landmark moment in the legal system's understanding of complex trauma and psychological manipulation. The case established important precedents for how courts handle cases involving long-term captivity and psychological abuse. For Colleen, the conviction provided a measure of justice and validation, though it could not undo the years of trauma she had endured. The legal proceedings, while necessary, had also been re-traumatizing and had required her to relive her worst experiences in a public setting. Janice Hooker received a lighter sentence as part of her plea agreement and cooperation with prosecutors. While her complicity in Colleen's abuse was undeniable, the court recognized that she too had been a victim of Cameron's manipulation and control. Colleen's journey toward healing and recovery was long and complex, involving years of therapy and the gradual rebuilding of her sense of self and autonomy. The psychological effects of 7 years of captivity could not be overcome quickly or easily. One of the most challenging aspects of Colleen's recovery was overcoming the learned helplessness and hyper-compliance that had developed during her captivity. She had to relearn basic decision-making skills and develop confidence in her own judgment after years of having every aspect of her life controlled by others. The trauma bonding that had developed with her captors also had to be addressed through therapy. Despite the abuse she had suffered, Colleen found herself sometimes missing aspects of the structured environment of her captivity and feeling confused about her relationships with Cameron and Janice Hooker. Post-traumatic stress disorder was a significant challenge in Colleen's recovery. She experienced nightmares, flashbacks, and severe anxiety reactions to reminders of her captivity. Simple things like confined spaces or electrical devices could trigger intense fear responses that took years to manage through therapy. The support of Colleen's family was crucial to her recovery, though they also struggled to understand what she had experienced and how to best help her heal. The entire family required counseling to address the trauma and rebuild their relationships after 7 years of separation and uncertainty. The Colleen Stan case has had a profound impact on the fields of criminal psychology, victimology, and trauma studies. Her experience provided unprecedented insight into the psychology of long-term captivity and the mechanisms through which perpetrators maintain control over their victims. The case contributed significantly to understanding of Stockholm Syndrome, the psychological phenomenon where hostages develop positive feelings toward their captors. Colleen's experience demonstrated how this syndrome could develop even in cases of extreme abuse and how it could be deliberately fostered through systematic psychological manipulation. Research into learned helplessness was also advanced by studying Colleen's case. Her experience illustrated how prolonged exposure to inescapable situations could lead to a generalized sense of powerlessness that persisted even when escape became possible. The case also highlighted the role of complex trauma in shaping victim behavior. The combination of physical abuse, sexual assault, psychological manipulation, and social isolation created a form of trauma that was more severe and complex than what had been previously studied in most clinical settings. Legal professionals gained important insights into how to handle cases involving complex trauma and psychological manipulation. The successful prosecution of Cameron Hooker despite the unusual circumstances of the case provided a template for similar cases and helped establish legal precedents for understanding victim behavior in extreme situations. The Colleen Stan case attracted extensive media coverage that both helped and hindered public understanding of her experience. While the attention brought important awareness to issues of kidnapping and psychological abuse, it also subjected Colleen to additional trauma and invasion of privacy. The media coverage often focused on the sensational aspects of the case, the "girl in the box" headlines that emphasized the physical imprisonment while sometimes overlooking the more complex psychological dimensions of her captivity. This focus, while understandable from a journalistic perspective, sometimes reinforced misconceptions about why Colleen had not escaped when she had opportunities to do so. Public reaction to the case was mixed, with many people expressing sympathy and support for Colleen while others questioned her actions and decisions during captivity. This victim-blaming response was unfortunately common and reflected broader societal misunderstandings about trauma and abuse dynamics. The case also sparked important conversations about safety, particularly regarding hitchhiking and accepting rides from strangers. While these discussions were valuable, they sometimes shifted focus away from perpetrator responsibility and toward victim prevention strategies. Educational institutions and advocacy organizations used the case as a teaching tool to help people understand the complex dynamics of abuse and trauma. This educational use of Colleen's experience, while sometimes difficult for her personally, helped advance public awareness of these important issues. More than 4 decades after her rescue, Colleen Stan's case continues to provide important lessons for law enforcement, mental health professionals, legal practitioners, and the general public. Her experience remains one of the most extensively studied cases of long-term captivity and psychological manipulation. The case has informed training programs for law enforcement officers, helping them understand how trauma affects victim behavior and why victims sometimes act in ways that seem counterintuitive or suspicious. This training has been crucial in improving law enforcement responses to trafficking and abuse cases. Mental health professionals continue to study Colleen's case to better understand complex trauma and develop more effective treatment approaches. Her experience has contributed to the development of specialized therapies for survivors of long-term abuse and captivity. The legal precedents established by the case continue to influence how courts handle cases involving psychological manipulation and coercive control. The successful prosecution despite unusual circumstances has provided a framework for similar cases and helped establish the legitimacy of expert testimony on trauma and abuse dynamics. For the general public, Colleen's case serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of understanding and believing abuse survivors, even when their experiences seem difficult to comprehend. It illustrates the complex ways that trauma affects human behavior and the need for compassion and support in the healing process. In the years following her recovery, Colleen Stan has worked to rebuild her life and find meaning in her experiences. While she has generally maintained privacy about her personal life, she has occasionally spoken publicly about her experience to help educate others and support fellow survivors. Colleen's decision to speak publicly about her experience has been both empowering and challenging. While sharing her story has helped others understand the dynamics of abuse and captivity, it has also meant repeatedly reliving traumatic experiences and dealing with public scrutiny. Her advocacy work has focused particularly on helping other survivors of long-term abuse and captivity. She has worked with organizations that support trafficking victims and has provided consultation to law enforcement and mental health professionals working with similar cases. The process of writing and speaking about her experience has been part of Colleen's ongoing healing journey. By transforming her trauma into education and advocacy, she has found ways to create meaning from her suffering and help prevent similar tragedies for others. Colleen's resilience and recovery serve as powerful testimony to the human capacity for healing and growth even after extreme trauma. Her ability to rebuild her life and help others demonstrates that while trauma can have profound effects, it does not have to define or limit a person's future. The case of Colleen Stan forces us to confront difficult questions about the nature of evil, the psychology of control, and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Cameron Hooker's crimes represent one of the most systematic and prolonged cases of psychological and physical torture in modern American criminal history. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the severity of the abuse, but the calculated nature of Cameron's psychological manipulation. His creation of the company fiction and his systematic conditioning techniques demonstrate a level of premeditation and psychological sophistication that challenges our understanding of criminal behavior. The case also illustrates the complex dynamics of victimization and survival. Colleen's behavior during captivity, which might seem puzzling or even complicit to outside observers, actually demonstrates remarkable psychological adaptation to an impossible situation. Her survival through 7 years of extreme abuse is testament to human resilience and the will to live even under the most horrific circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, the case demonstrates the power of truth and courage to overcome even the most elaborate systems of control and deception. Janice Hooker's decision to reveal the truth about the company, despite the personal risks involved, ultimately freed both Colleen and herself from Cameron's psychological prison. The legacy of this case extends far beyond the individuals directly involved. It has contributed to our understanding of trauma, improved law enforcement and legal responses to complex abuse cases, and provided hope to other survivors that recovery and justice are possible even after the most extreme victimization. For students of criminal psychology and victimology, the Colleen Stan case remains one of the most important and instructive examples of how psychological manipulation can be used as a tool of control, and how victims can survive and recover from even the most systematic abuse. It reminds us that behind every criminal case are real human beings whose lives have been forever changed by their experiences, and whose courage in seeking justice helps protect others from similar fates. The story of Colleen Stan is ultimately one of survival, recovery, and the triumph of truth over deception. While the crimes committed against her represent some of humanity's darkest impulses, her survival and recovery demonstrate our capacity for healing, growth, and resilience in the face of even the most overwhelming challenges. This case study represents one of the most significant examples of long-term captivity and psychological manipulation in modern criminal history. The detailed examination of the psychological, legal, and social dimensions of this case provides crucial insights into the nature of complex trauma, victim behavior, and the process of recovery and justice. The lessons learned from Colleen Stan's experience continue to influence how we understand and respond to cases of severe abuse and human trafficking.